Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. This is your host, Crazy Horse speaking, that we're going to be doing a Lenten series on the Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, as most of you who probably maybe grew up in my generation or a little after, if you think about Dorian Gray, you might immediately think about the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It kind of seems more like a Halloween theme, like a ghost story. But really, it's a morality tale. So I was kind of inspired to do this whenever I saw that the Hallowed app was going to be doing Brothers Karamazov. And I'm pretty picky whenever it comes to Dostoevsky. Really, the only one that I liked was The Idiot. I couldn't really get through Brothers Karamazov because it just felt like death by nicknames, and that Crime and Punishment was just a bit delirium. I confess, with other Russian novels, I only got through Anna Karenina because I watched the movie first, and so I could kind of piecemeal together how the story actually one event connected to another. The Picture of Dorian Gray is much more simple. So I would almost put this like on a 4th grade reading level. Like, it really is a simple book to get through, and it's a pretty book. That's one of the things too, that Oscar Wilde was an aesthetic. So he was coming out of a tradition that had kind of downplayed aesthetic, that the Puritans were sort of having a bit of a revival, where black and whatnot, that they'd seen Queen Victoria in her mourning weaves, and that now in Oscar Wilde's time you had people that were bucking that trend and wanted things to be pretty again, not just drab and black and gray like I'm dressed today, but they wanted things to be pretty. And a lot of the really imagery of the Picture of Dorian Gray is very pretty. So how we're going to format this is maybe going 3 to 4 chapters at a time. Probably chapter 11 will get its own episode just by itself, because that really is just a really hard one to get through, was chapter 11. But what we're going to try to focus on is doing 3 chapters at a time, and then we're going to sort of ascribe a moral to the story of each of these sections leading up to Holy Week, and where we'll get our sort of final confrontation with the Picture of Dorian Gray. So I'm going to start off with a story from my own life. So my daughter and I were at an Orthodox church. And if you've ever been in an Orthodox church, it has a very open floor pattern. There's not really any pews. So she was a bit bored out of her mind. There were other kids there that were also a bit bored out of their mind. A bit of a row core child experience. We're Catholic actually, but we were just in a row core church on that Sunday. That's Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, for those who aren't familiar with the lingo. And she hugged another girl, and the other girl hugged her back, but my daughter just kind of held on for a little too long. And the other girl looked at me like, she didn't say anything, but you could see in her eyes, it's just like, are you going to do anything about this? So, I kind of broke it up almost like a boxing referee. That I asked her, why did you hold on for that much longer? And she said, because she's pretty. And just off the cuff, this is now sage advice that I have for most people, is pretty people are people too. And that is really one of the things that I feel like is the theme that we get from these first 3 chapters of Dorian Gray, if we're to try to moralize through it a little bit, is that pretty people are people too. for the first 2 chapters, Dorian's not even in the story. That it starts with a conversation between Lord Henry and the artist Basil. Now, the artist is saying that he put too much of himself into a picture, which it immediately reads strange to the reader, because how do you put yourself into a portrait of another? So how do you put yourself into the portrait of another? And Lord Henry is almost having none of it. He is attack of the epithets. He's just attack of just the sophistry of just like, he strings along these very sophist proverbs together of the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about at all type of thinking. Like this is the type of person that Lord Henry is. And Basil, on the other hand, this is the early days of psychology, and it seems like Oscar Wilde had a grasp on what we would today call a codependent. And this is Basil. Basil depends on Dorian. He even states he needs Dorian. And that's just a classic codependency example where he derives his happiness. So like this is the verbatim words that Basil uses to describe Dorian. And when Henry meets Dorian, Lord Henry is a classic hedonist. Like, he just does not care. It's just all about, like, he just does it for the vine. He does it for the lulz. Everything is just the string of sophistic proverbs, and he doesn't really want to take responsibility for what comes of his sophistic statements. One of the things that Lord Henry says that I kind of caught on to, he says that basically a marriage is more or less about just staying out of each other's way. My wife never knows where I am. I never know where she is. And look at us. We've been happily married for 20 years. You know, so these are the types of things that he'll say. And then kind of progressing into chapter 2, they go into the garden. And the garden this is where I say it's a pretty book. The garden is described in very pretty terms, and you can really easily paint that picture in your brain of how the garden is described. I love the garden scene because it's pretty. And they're sitting in the garden. Lord Henry is smoking. They're taking tea together. And this is where we finally meet our character, Dorian Gray. And he is almost like an emo kid. He's about 17, maybe 19 years old. And he is just a little basket of feelings. Just everything's just, he's so sensitive to everything. And like will almost cry over the smallest provocation. He's very, very delicate. And like I said, the closest thing that I could think of is like an emo kid, or maybe if you're familiar with, like, if you're a world literature nut like I am, maybe the Tale of Genji from the Heian Japanese period. He's just this little tight ball of feelings. And Lord Henry takes an immediate liking to him. Why? Not because he's particularly sophisticated or eloquent or interesting. He's just really good looking. And this is where we're going to start getting into something like Eros. So whenever coming at this from a Catholic Lenten perspective, that whenever you have John Paul II talking about Eros, that Eros is a desire to be around someone, that Eros is something that awakens inside of you. And this is usually talked about as like a sort of sexual love, but there is a sort of asexual Eros. And I think this is what we're dealing with Basil and Lord Henry. It is worth mentioning, though, I'm going to throw this out here and then completely leave it aside, that Oscar Wilde was a homosexual. That this is something that he admitted to in a court of law, that Oscar Wilde was a homosexual. So maybe there are somewhat of these homoerotic feelings that are baked into the tapestry, but there's nothing explicitly stated about Lord Henry or about Basil that indicate that their attraction to Dorian was of a sexual nature. But remember how I mentioned with Basil before. So this is where we start to turn the page into chapter 3. So chapter 3 is where we have the infamous deal, as some might call it. The deal, think of like Coraline. Are you going to give up your eyes for the buttons and stay with us forever? So that's an example of the deal. Lord Henry mentions, would you like to remain forever as the picture is? Dorian is actually sobbing at this point. Like, he's thrown himself on the couch. It's very dramatic language. He's thrown himself down on the couch. He's sobbing that I'll get old and this picture will remain young forever. Oh no. Like, total drama queen. Like, it is deliberately pathetic. And this is when Lord Henry mentions the idea of, would you like for this or that? And it is sort of a idea in the head at this point. It's not like, he went down to the crossroads in Mississippi and traded his soul to the devil for this. We're actually at no point yet where Dorian is acting badly in any sort of way, except for, his somewhat effeminacy. So, we've got the deal has almost been struck at this point. And, yeah, at one point Basil says, I'll destroy the picture if it's making you upset. And this makes Dorian even more upset. And it's just a whole hullabaloo. It's very Victorian. But as I mentioned before, with Basil being codependent on Lord Henry, now at the end, how chapter 3 closes is that Lord Henry is saying that he wants to own Dorian. He desires Dorian for his own, as essentially his property. All influence is immoral. So you're outside of authenticity. You are in a state where you aren't actually thinking your own thoughts. You're thinking the thoughts of someone else. So that influence is a sort of violence. But this is what Lord Henry wants. He wants to own. He wants to dominate Dorian Gray. And it's really in this sort of weird, like, living vicariously through Dorian Gray, that he wants all the things that Dorian Gray has and all the opportunities that he has via his good looks. So it's sort of like that high school football game where you see a 40-something-year-old man with Connor's dad, on his shirt type of sense of wanting to live life through Dorian and in a way own Dorian. And this is also Eros at domination. So there's Eros dominated, which is where Basil is, being codependent on Dorian, and Lord Henry, Eros dominating, which is where Lord Henry is. And where John Paul II wants to say is Eros needs to be oriented toward self-gift. And this is where we'll pick up in the next episode when we talk about the Sybil Vane chapters. Once again, I'm Crazy Horse, your host. Stay on the land.